Hi, in this videotape, we're going to get down to business. We'll use the visual framework that we've outlined in the first two videos to explain how to create different styles of mixes. This is mixing theory. Plato and all those Greek dudes wrote myriads of books on a wide range of art forms, including music theory. Mixing, on the other hand, is a new art form. You could say it's still in its adolescent form. You see, we've only had stereo for about 30 years. We have a lot of books that explain what all the equipment in the studio does, but there are virtually no books that try to explain the aesthetic side of what makes a great mix. Hardly anybody has tried to even approach the whole world of artistic values, perhaps because it's so fraught with different people's values. The normal process for learning to make a great mix is through experience with recording each style of music. First, you learn the tools and how they're used in each style of music. But you might have gotten to the point where you begin to wonder why your mixes don't sound like CDs. And you know professional engineers are getting great mixes every time. Certain professional engineers command extremely large fees because they are capable of coming up with something that most people perceive as great every time. So what is it they're doing? It isn't magic. They're doing some very specific things. Now that we have a framework for explaining what is done in a mix, we can now explore these things that engineers are doing to make such great mixes. This video is designed to help you discover these high-level values that major engineers have. Because you see, once you understand what these other guys are doing, you get a good perspective on what can be done. Then you can do whatever the hell you want, based on your own values. In order to determine what makes a great mix, we must first determine what you can do in a mix as opposed to what you can do during the recording session. There are a wide range of aspects that contribute to a good recording besides the mix. The mix is only one of a number of aspects. If any one of these components isn't happening, then it will stick out like a sore thumb and say, "Mix sucks." The professional engineer will often help the band refine all of these aspects during the session. We'll cover how to refine each of these components later on in aspects of a recorded piece of music. The mix is only one of all of these components. There are 4 types of tools that you can use in a mix to create all the different styles of mixes in the world. The tools are volume faders, pan pots, equalization, and effects. The question is, what can we do with these tools? As mentioned in the previous video, the equipment in the studio, the art of mixing is the way in which the dynamics we create with the equipment in the studio interface with the dynamics apparent in music and songs. So what are the dynamics in the music?
When we speak about dynamics, we're not talking about common terminology used for volume dynamics. We're not talking about changes in loudness. We are talking about changes in intensity, musical dynamics, any type of change in the music that causes a change in a person.
Well, the dynamics in the music are as different as people are.
That which comes from music is as varied as life itself.
Some people feel very strong emotions when they hear some types of music. Probably the most common dynamic that people see in music is simply up or down. Whatever the content of the up or down is, this is a common perception around music. Some people see structure in music, and sometimes they relate these structures to common structures found in the world, such as buildings, bridges, and pyramids. Some people actually see the workings of the brain in a song. They see the way in which our minds work as being the same as the flow of the song. Some people even think of songs as thought forms. In fact, Some bands write their music in this way to represent the way our brains work. This explains the common theory that music is just an extension of our personalities.
You've got it backwards, Grasshopper. The music came first. You are an extension of the music.
Some people relate to music through music theory. They see notes on a scale, they see intervals, they see chords. They see the structure of the song in musical terminology. Some people have physical reactions, like dancing. Not only does music move us physically, but there's also a whole world of music therapy based on the healing vibrations of sound. Some people see visual imagery. Walt Disney saw all kinds of things, including flying elephants. Just check out MTV to see a whole nother world of visual imagery. You might say, I see bubbles. Some people see spiritual connotations. The whole world of religious music is a good example. Some people see some music as a direct connection to God. There's a wide range of possible dynamics that music evokes in different people. Different people get different things out of music. It's true. All of the things that people get out of music are as varied as people and life itself. The trick is for the recording engineer to create musical dynamics with the equipment that match dynamics that people see in music, whatever those dynamics might be. Everything that you could possibly think of as to how music affects you or anyone else is valid. Anything anybody gets out of music is real. The art of the engineer is to enhance or bring out those musical dynamics even more with the equipment in the studio. Now, what are the dynamics that we can create with the equipment in the studio? With volume faders, pan pots, equalization, and effects. Let's start with volume faders.
For those of you who are of a mind that would like to follow the overall structure of the presentation, let us show you a graphic of how it is all organized. We will be going through each of the tools in the studio: volume, EQ, panning, and effects. As we go through each one, we will explain the dynamics that can be created with each one based on, first, the difference between individual levels or settings for that piece of equipment. Second, the overall patterns that can be created between the relationships of all the sounds in the mix. And third, what happens when you move the knobs during the mix, an especially effective dynamic.
As I was saying, let's start with volume. The question is, what kind of dynamics can we create with the relative volumes set by the faders on the console? Most people first think of the dynamics that you can create by moving the faders during the mix. In fact, this is an extremely powerful dynamic. When you change the volume of a sound during a mix, you can create a dynamic that is so powerful that it can overwhelm the song. The movement of the fader can be such a strong dynamic that it becomes the primary focus of the entire mix at that moment. But even more importantly, there are somewhat more subtle dynamics that are created just by simply placing the volume of the faders at specific levels and leaving them there. Most people think of balancing the volume of sounds to mean to make them all even. The process is actually much more complex. Often we don't want all the instruments to be the same volume. We normally want one instrument to be a bit louder than another. In fact, the exact volume relationships between each sound in a mix are very specifically set by a recording engineer. For example, a lead vocal will come across completely different if it is extremely loud in the mix. That is, if it is way out in front of the rest of the mix.
Spirits are in commotion, the elements in harmony. She blinded
the singing and the message being transmitted by the lyrics will be perceived completely differently depending on how loud the vocal is in the mix. And you see, this is a dynamic that the engineer controls by where he places the fader in the mix. Actually, the musical dynamics that can be created with volume relationships are much more complex than you might have ever imagined. In fact, traditions have evolved for specific volumes of particular instruments for different types of music and songs. Let's explore them this way.
Now remember, we're discussing relative apparent volumes. You see the apparent volume of a sound is also dependent upon the waveform of a sound. For example, a chainsaw sounds louder to our ear than a flute, even if they are both exact same volume. So the apparent volume is the level that sounds seem to be to our ear.
If we think of volume in decibels, based on sound pressure level, then there are around 140 different levels of volume. But in order to make this wide range of levels more accessible, let's divide them into 6 different levels like this. If we take a look at a mix and divide it into 6 ranges of volume, these are the instruments that we commonly find at each level. Level 1. Sounds at this volume in mixes are unusually loud. In fact, it's quite rare that sounds are ever at this level. The alarm clocks in Time from Dark Side of the Moon, by Pink Floyd's a good example. Explosions and primal screams can also be this loud. Normally, though, if an inexperienced engineer places a sound at this volume, it's thought of as an error. Level 2. Sounds at this volume are normally lead instruments and vocals. However, certain songs and types of music will put the vocals here. For example, big band music and middle-of-the-road Barry Manilow type of music. Also, if the vocals or lyrics are the main focus of attention, like in Bob Dylan, they might put the vocals this loud. Likewise, if a song has a great singer, his or her vocals are often placed at this level in the mix. Other instruments found at this volume might include the boom in rap music, or the kick drums or toms in heavy metal. Horn blasts in big band music and symphony blasts in classical music often reach level 2. Level 3. Sounds at this volume normally consist of primary rhythm parts, such as guitar or some type of keyboard. Lead vocals in a lot of rock and roll are also set at this level. Other examples include kick drums in most heavy metal, snare drums in most dance music, most toms in most styles of music, and cymbals, with hi-hat only occasionally at this level, although jazz and dance music often place it here. Phil Collins is probably about the first person to place reverb on the drums at this level, level 3. Level 4. Sounds at this level include rhythm beds and chordal pads such as background piano, keys, or guitar. Drums in a lot of jazz, middle of the road, and easy rock are also at this level. When reverb is noticeable as a sound on its own, it's normally here. Background vocals and strings are also often at this level, but of course they can vary. Level 5. Sounds at this level include things like the kick drum in jazz and big band music. Lots of effects and reverb often get placed here so that you can only hear them if you listen closely. Background vocals sometimes also get relegated to this level. Some producers also use this level to make their mark. Level 6. Sounds at this level are so soft that they are hard to detect. Pink Floyd is famous for adding little whispers or almost subliminal sounds to draw you into the mix. Sounds at this level can be very effective, but it's important they serve to add to the overall mix in some way. If these sounds do not fit just right, they can sound just like noise. This chart of the 6 different levels has only been presented to give us a framework so we can now explore all the different levels for each instrument in different styles of music. As you will see, different instruments are commonly placed at different levels. Let's take a look.
I don't believe it. There she goes again. She's tied it up. I can't find it. All my tubes and wires, careful notes. Writing actions.
Now, as previously mentioned, different styles of music have developed their own traditions as to the volume that particular instruments are placed within a mix. Let's look at each type of sound individually. What about vocals? Let's take a look at various examples of vocals being placed at different levels in the mix. Think about it. Vocals are commonly mixed at different levels for different types of music and for different types of songs. For example, probably the loudest we hear vocals is a cappella. Just kidding. Vocals are commonly quite loud in middle-of-the-road music.
I got it back. I got it back. And that ain't good.
Of course, in opera, the vocals are also quite loud. The vocals are commonly mixed loudly in folk music as well.
I'm a guitar man. Whoa. I'm a guitar man. Whoa. I'm a guitar man.
And in big band music,
So when you hear it thunder, don't you run under a tree. There'll be pennies from heaven for you and me. Don't you know there's bound to be pennies from heaven for you and me?
and in country music.
So baby, just leave me and say goodbye. Come on now, let me go, babe. Come on, baby, now let me go. Oh, come on now, let me.
Besides the style of music dictating the level of vocals, the song can also make a big difference. Songs where the lyrics are the focus of the entire song often have the vocals mixed right out front. Bob Dylan's a perfect example. On the other hand, think of examples where the vocals are mixed quite low as level 4 even. An example of vocals being so low are those in songs by Enya. Commonly, vocals are mixed quite low in a lot of types of rock and roll. Perfect example is Pink Floyd or any alternative rock. Besides the style of music, there are a number of reasons that you might turn the vocals up or down in a mix. If they suck, you normally shouldn't put them out front, whereas if they're great, show them off. Now, what about snare? Same as with vocals, the volume that a snare is placed in a mix is dependent on the style of music and the song. Big band music and jazz often have the snare mixed quite low as level 4.
Just ask me if you're in doubt, 'cause I'm hip. Now I'm deep into Zen, meditation, and macrobiotics. As soon as I can, I intend to get into narcotics. 'Cause I'm cool as a cute.
It is also interesting to note that a lot of easy rock and ballads commonly mix the snare quite low. However, some ballads do have a massive snare sound turned up quite loud.
You knew I was waiting. It should have been easy. Oh, Marianne, who did you lie to?
Rock and roll is probably most responsible for the snare's progression up the volume scale. But in the 60s, dance music and then disco helped to raise the level of the snare even another level. These days, some types of rock and roll have the snare as loud as level 2. Now check out kick drums. Again, the style of music makes the biggest difference. Big band music and jazz commonly have the level of the kick drum down around level 4 or even level 5. It's also interesting that even a lot of Jimi Hendrix's music was mixed with the kick drum down around level 4 so that you could hardly hear it. Another interesting thing is that over the last 20 or so years, the kick drum has made its way up the scale, becoming louder and louder in mixes. Heavy metal was probably responsible for raising the kick drum up a whole level. Heavy metal commonly places the kick drum up around level 2. Rap, and now hip-hop, have almost taken it off the top of the scale.
Yeah!
Now, let's take a look at volume levels of bass guitar. Bass guitar started out barely in mixes at all.
Sunday morning, there lies a body, eat just oozing life. There's someone sneaking around that corner. Could that someone be Mac the Knife?
In big band, it was down around level 3 or 4. In a lot of jazz, it's actually now quite high, close to level 2. Even in a lot of rock and roll, the bass guitar is not as loud as many people often think, although it does vary a lot. Then rap began a revolution.
One MC with a speedy DJ, creating the beats with a funky bass line, put into congruent along with my rhyme. The rhymes are flowing, the beats are growing. They said it couldn't happen, but now I'm showing what it takes to make it in this world of music. So now I got to use it. Now back to the jumping, gotta stop slumping, cause you know we gotta do something. Make this party.
Check it out. Even Peter Gabriel has a rap boom on his last album. Not only did rap help to raise the level of bass guitars in mixes, it has also even changed the hardware. When you go to a stereo store, you see things like mega bass and, of course, boom boxes. And stereos are now capable of handling a lot more bass than in the old days. It's also interesting that reggae and the blues often have the level of the bass quite a bit louder than in other styles of music, sometimes as high as level 2.
Ever since you left me, baby, oh, sure been lonely round here. I got every reason for crying, but they ain't got no blues, no, not me, dear. Ain't got no blues.
Commonly, the fewer instruments in a mix, the louder the bass. This is probably because you need something to fill out the space between the speakers. If you have a lot of instruments in a mix, there just isn't enough room for the bass guitar. Also, a bass will mask the other sounds if too loud, so it is often mixed at a low volume to leave more space for the other sounds in the mix. What about toms? Toms are commonly mixed lower than most people think in most types of music. Toms are probably mixed low because often the bleed of the cymbals in the tom mics are annoying. Effects also vary a lot in different mixes. Reverb has progressed up the scale over the years. In fact, it was probably Phil Collins and Genesis who were responsible for raising the level of reverb an entire level. Pink Floyd has just about taken over the title for having the effects the loudest in their mixes. Other sounds like hi-hats, cymbals, rhythm guitars, horn sections, and background vocals are also mixed at various levels depending on the song and the style of music. In fact, you might start checking out the relative level of every sound in every song the rest of your life. As you can see, you can create an incredible variety of musical dynamics based on the level that you set each sound in the mix. And each style of music has developed its own traditions for the specific level that each instrument should be set. Of course, for some styles of music, the traditions are stricter than others. Big band music and jazz are pretty strict, whereas the rules for rap and hip-hop are extremely loose. Also, of course, the song and all of its details can make a big difference as to the levels at which each sound is placed. And finally, the people you are working with can make a big difference. You can only argue so long with someone who's telling you to turn up their instrument or else. But do argue. Give them hell. Besides all of the individual volume levels of each instrument, there are dynamics that can be created with the overall relationships of all of the volume levels in a mix. We call these volume patterns.
For those of you following along, we are now here on the graphic.
In some styles of music, the range of volumes might vary only from here to here. New Age music, alternative rock, middle-of-the-road music, country music, and easy rock are often mixed this way, such that there is very little difference between the softest and loudest sound in the mix. Muzak might be said to be the extreme example. All sounds are pretty even in volume, such that none ever jumps out and shocks us. This might be totally appropriate for a love song. On the other hand, some styles of music are mixed with extreme variations between the softest and loudest sounds, like this. Commonly, lots of rock and roll is mixed this way. Also, big band music is a perfect example of this type of mix. You might have extremely soft sounds followed by huge horn blasts. Pink Floyd's well known for trying to shock the hell out of you with alarm clocks and explosions. It can be quite fun and exhilarating. Besides the style of music, the type of song can also make a big difference as to the overall range of volume levels. For example, a love song might be mixed quite evenly. A song about explosive behavior might be quite uneven.
Here we are again.
Volumes can not only range in dynamics from the softest to the loudest sound in the mix, but an individual sound can be raised and lowered within the song. Anytime faders are moved while a sound is playing, the dynamic created tends to be very intense. If the level of a sound is changed at a good transition point, such as the beginning of a chorus or a lead break, a dynamic's created, but it's not nearly as intense as when changing a sound while it's playing.
Let me show you a magic trick. If you bring a sound out front by turning the volume up at the beginning of a song, you can then turn that sound down, and since we heard it so well, it will be clear in our brain what that sound is doing, even if it is then set back low in the mix. Then bring up another sound in the mix so we can check it out, and then bring it down in the mix, and once we hear a sound loud and clear, it doesn't have to continue to be loud in order to recognize it. If you keep doing this, you can create the illusion that all the sounds in the mix are loud and clear.
Sometimes, of course, the volume of the entire mix can be raised or lowered. The overall volume can be cut or boosted or gradually faded. Such dynamics can be very effective if appropriate for the song. Besides moving a fader to create volume dynamics, Commonly, you need to adjust levels just to keep the volumes more even. An engineer often must constantly adjust levels up and down just to keep things even. Compressor limiters can only do so much before they make a sound unnatural. Therefore, another dynamic that can be created with the faders is to actually even out the volumes more by moving the faders throughout the mix.
Oh, we're right about here now.
Now, how can you create musical dynamics with equalization? Well, just as with volume faders, there's a large and complex world of EQ relationships between instruments in the mix. There are two main types of considerations that professional recording engineers use when equalizing sounds for a mix. The first is based on how the sound sounds by itself, in solo, the primary consideration when first EQing the sound at the beginning of the recording session. This consideration is usually based on whether you are going for a sound that is natural or interesting. The second consideration is how the sound sounds in the mix, relative to the other instruments, and is of the utmost importance of the two. It used to be that engineers would go out into the room where the instrument is and listen. Then they would go back into the control room and compare the sound in the speakers to what they heard out in the room. However, these days, natural is defined by what is currently on CDs and the radio. You see, natural ain't natural no more. We have become addicted to crisper, brighter, cleaner, as well as fatter, fuller, and bigger. Therefore, to make sounds sound natural can be boring and unnaturally dull by today's standards. What we hear on the radio and on CDs these days are much brighter and crisper than the real thing. Now, what we consider to be natural is an average of what we hear on the market daily. If it isn't bright enough, it won't be considered to be right. On the other hand, these days, often the goal is to come up with a sound that sounds unique or interesting, not necessarily one that sounds natural. I mean, who knows what a natural piece of sheet metal sounds like anyway? The question is, what makes a sound interesting or unique? One thing that makes a sound interesting is the complexity of the sound. The more complex the sound, the more it can stand repeated listening. The more you listen to it, the more you hear.
Oh, we're moving right along. We're right about here now.
Structuring the relationship between the tonalities present in each of the instruments is an important aspect that a recording engineer deals with in mixing. As with balancing volume relationships, it's commonly thought that it is most desirable to have the EQ of all of the instruments as even as possible so that they blend well. Well, sometimes this is the case. However, it is often desirable for certain instruments in a mix to be unusually bright, dark, or mid-rangey. Commonly, sounds are mixed so they do work well with each other. Sounds can be made to sound more similar to each other or more dissimilar. A lead instrument might be made to be more cutting and abrasive so as to really grab attention. An instrument might be given extra bass to make the song more danceable or just to excite the rap listener. As previously covered in the second video on equipment, in order to simplify things, we can compare the relative EQ of each sound at each frequency range. We can create various EQ relationships at each frequency range, highs, mid-range, and lows. Although there are a wide range of possibilities for creating EQ dynamics, there's only so much you can do to be creative with EQ. Commonly, the goal, especially for the beginning engineer, is not to be creative with EQ, but to get things just to sound normal, to sound right. Most people are glad if they can just get a mix to sound right. In fact, the boundaries of how creative you can be with EQ before it sounds weird is quite limited. If you go beyond these limits, you're normally no longer being creative. You just have a bad mix. The trick is to learn the limits so that you can be creative within the limits of sanity. The goal is to get to the point where you know the limits of creativity so well that you can EQ something a little off-center. You can make something sound a little strange as an effect. This is when you're truly being creative with EQ. It's funny. The problem comes when you create EQ that is a bit off-center from being exactly natural as an effect, and someone in the band complains that the instrument doesn't sound right. Not only should any unusual EQ be appropriate for the style of music in the song, but you can only do it if the band will let you, or if you can convince them how it works and how cool it is.
We're right about here now.
Because we are so limited as to how creative we can be with EQ, to make EQ changes in a sound while it is playing creates a dynamic that is extremely noticeable. If not appropriate for the song, this could be quite distracting. A good example of where this has been done well is in Aqualung by Jethro Tull, where the voice goes to a telephone-like voice. Pink Floyd also did it in Wish You Were Here, where the acoustic guitar goes into a little box type of sound. Currently, it is considered to be very unusual to actually change EQ settings during a mix. However, it just might be the next creative frontier, especially for those mixing hip-hop and the like.
As we continue our overview of the way that you can use studio equipment to create different musical dynamics, we have evolved to here.
As previously discussed, panning is mapped out visually as a function of left to right. The big question is, what kind of musical dynamics can you create with the placement of pan pots on the mixer? If we think of the space between the speakers as a palette, and the sounds are the colors that we place on the palette, then panning can be based on crowd control. You might want some sounds to be panned as far from each other as possible in order to create clarity. Such a dynamic might be appropriate for certain types of music like acoustic jazz, folk music, and bluegrass. On the other hand, sounds may be panned such that they overlap in order to create a wall of sound, making the mix seem more cohesive. This is commonly done in heavy metal, alternative rock, and new age music. However, panning is often done based on certain traditions that have developed over the years, defining the norm for panning particular instruments. Also, particular styles of music have developed their own traditions for the placement of particular instruments left to right in the stereo field. In fact, it is almost like if you follow these traditions, you create a dynamic that is transparent and lets the music through more. Whereas if you don't follow these traditions, you create a dynamic that might call attention to itself. This is not to say that it's wrong to pan things differently than normal, but you should just be aware of the fact that you're doing it. It could actually be totally cool and appropriate and could change the world. As with fader volumes, some styles of music have stricter rules than others. For example, you can practically do whatever you want in hip-hop, whereas in big band music, it's important to set up your panning the way a big band would normally set up on stage. Acoustic jazz is also sometimes panned just the way the band would be on stage. An engineer will sometimes even place the musicians in the studio as if they were on stage. I've mixed some folk bands just exactly the way that they were standing out in the studio. Doing this helps you to create the illusion that you are there with the band, which can be a nice illusion. In order to obtain the most natural panning of a drum set, try this. First, pan the overhead mics on the drums completely left and right, like this. Then, listen for the left-right placement of each drum in this stereo overhead mix. Pan the mic of each individual drum to exactly where you hear it in the overhead mix. For example, listen to where the hi-hat seems to be in the overhead mix and place the hi-hat mic right there. Same with the toms. Listen to where each one seems to be in the overhead mix and place each tom accordingly. This will give you the clearest imaging you can obtain. You see, if the toms are here in the overhead mix, and then you place the tom mic themselves over here, it's like you have panned the toms in stereo. If you place the tom mic right where they are in the overhead mix, voila, precise imaging of the toms in one place. However, these days it's quite a bit more common to not pan the instruments as they are on stage. More and more people will pan them to wherever they sound the coolest. It's interesting to note the way that drums have been panned throughout the history of recording. The Beatles placed the vocals in one speaker and the rest of the band in another.
Although this was a mistake, they meant for 2 tracks to be mixed down to mono when the record was made, but the mastering engineer decided to be creative.
Many jazz groups have placed the entire drum set in one speaker. The advantage of doing this is that it leaves a huge amount of space between the speakers for the rest of the band. The big disadvantage is that the separation between individual pieces of the drum set becomes obscured. Now let's take a look at traditions in panning of particular instruments. Individual instruments have come to be commonly placed in specific positions from mix to mix. For example, it's rare that the kick drum is ever placed anywhere except in the middle. It isn't necessarily wrong to place it somewhere else, but it has become commonly accepted to be placed in the middle. This could be because a kick drum appears as a very large sound in the world of imaging.
The kick drum has so much energy it completely commands our attention.
Also, when the sound is in the middle between the speakers, you have 2 speakers carrying the sound instead of 1. Therefore, especially with big sounds like a kick drum or a bass guitar, the speakers don't have to work as hard, so it'll sound better.
The snare drum is most commonly placed in the middle. Some engineers do place it a bit off to the side, especially in jazz, because the snare drum is off to one side in a real drum set. The hi-hat is often placed off to one side also. It seems that most engineers will place the hi-hat halfway between the middle and the left side, like this. However, if you are creating a mix that is meant to be more spatial, it might be appropriate to pan the hi-hat all the way to one side. Now, in house music and hip-hop, not only can the hi-hat be panned anywhere, it is commonly moving during the entire mix and is sometimes recorded with a delay on it. In order to provide maximum fun, tom-toms are commonly spread completely left to right. However, for natural panning, the rack toms are sometimes placed in the middle, just like on a real drum set. A floor tom is normally placed on the far right. However, occasionally the floor tom will get placed in the center for the same reason we normally put kick drums and bass guitars in the middle, because they are so powerful and command so much attention, and because it will sound better when both speakers are carrying the sound. The discussion of tom placement brings up an interesting question. Should the toms be panned from left to right, as if from the drummer's perspective, or from right to left, from the audience's perspective? It seems that those who do live sound commonly pan from right to left, just like in a live show. However, many engineers pan from left to right, just like we read. The other interesting thing is that a lot of people have very strong feelings about this issue. Bass guitar is most commonly placed in the middle as it commands so much attention. Jazz and similar types of music oftentimes place the bass off to one side. This is normally only done when the sound of the bass itself is thinner or the bass EQ has been rolled off, making the sound thinner.
It's poetry in motion.
Lead vocals are overwhelmingly placed smack dab in the middle. If they are recorded in stereo, doubled, sung twice, or made into stereo with an effect, the stereo effect is normally spread evenly left to right. A solo piano is almost always panned completely left and right in stereo, just because it sounds so nice that way. Magical. If the mix is too busy already, that is, if there are a whole lot of instruments in the mix, sometimes it's still panned in stereo. Sometimes it is panned in mono when the mix is really busy. The left-right placement is completely dependent on the placement of the rest of the sounds in the mix when in mono. Again, you can do whatever you want with individual instrument sounds, depending on the style of music. This is just to let you know what is commonly done because a lot of people want their mixes to sound like what is on the radio. Any placement of individual instruments other than the above norms might be considered unusual, but it also just might be considered inappropriate. Besides individual placement of sounds between the speakers, even more important are the overall patterns you can create by panning in the overall mix.
So, we are now here.
With panning, you can create a symmetrical mix, or asymmetrical type mix. Symmetrical mixes might commonly be created for a love song or ballad. It might be created for a song about balanced ecology of mind, whereas an asymmetrical mix might be created for a song about psychotic, unbalanced behavior. Commonly, symmetrical mixes are used to create a balanced type of dynamic, whereas an asymmetrical mix creates a bit of tension. To get even more detailed, a balanced mix is often made to be symmetrical at each frequency range. For example, if a hi-hat is on the left, a shaker or acoustic guitar might be placed on the other side to balance the high frequency range. A guitar on the left might balance a mid-range keyboard on the right. Again, this is if you're going for a symmetrical mix. Creating balanced or lopsided mixes can be an especially effective dynamic when it is appropriate for the song. Movement of a sound from left to right during a mix also will create a very intense dynamic, so most engineers normally save such drastic creativity for special occasions. There are a number of ways that a sound can be moved this way, creating innumerable patterns of movement. Possibilities range from short, minuscule moves to full range and wide sweeping moves that go the full sweep from speaker to speaker, from pans that move slowly to pans that zoom back and forth between the speakers. Obviously, when it's appropriate for the song, this can be a great effect. Hendrix did it a lot, especially in crosstown traffic. Led Zeppelin went bananas in Whole Lotta Love. So far, we have covered 3 of the 4 tools that you can use to create dynamics in a mix: volume, EQ, and panning. Now, what type of dynamics can be created with effects? Well, there's an incredibly wide range of effects, and the dynamics that they create range from very subtle to very shocking, mesmerizing, and world-changing. It's just not within the perspective of this video to be able to go into all of the dynamics of each effect, including the wide range of variables that can be achieved by changing the parameters within each effect. but most of them are quite obvious. We all know what a reverb can do to a mix. We know what delays sound like. And if you don't know what flanging sounds like, try it out. It can be used to create very otherworldly type effects like being underwater. More details of specific effects will be covered in future videos. Now, when you look at the overall perspective of how effects contribute to making different styles of mixes, one of the most important dynamics is how they fill out a mix, making it sound fuller and bigger, more like a wall of sound.
By the way, we've just advanced to the next level.
With delays, you're adding extra sounds to the mix, so there are simply more sounds between the speakers. With short delays, less than 30 milliseconds, you get fattening that appears to stretch a sound between the speakers, again, filling out the mix, making it bigger. Flanging, chorusing, and phasing are all based on short delay times, so they too will tend to make the mix sound bigger and fuller. And of course, reverb is actually made up of hundreds of delays, so it takes up a lot of space in a mix and really fills out the mix tremendously. All of these effects will make a mix fuller, bigger, badder. However, they also make a mix busier. Therefore, if the mix is already busy with a lot of instruments and a lot of notes, it could become muddy. Commonly, these effects are only used when you have room for them. That is, when there aren't too many sounds in the mix in the first place. However, there are times when you might want to make a mix even bigger, even though it's already quite full. This is quite common with heavy metal. With heavy metal and a lot of hard rock, the bigger, the better. The more powerful, the more awesome. Therefore, you might consider adding effects to such a mix, even if things are already crowded. 48 guitars might not seem clean and clear, but if it's so big, it can be really cool. Now, certain types of music are commonly mixed with very few effects in order to create a sparse mix, where every single sound is completely separate from every other sound in the mix, and where each sound is easily distinguishable from all the other sounds in the mix. Bluegrass, acoustic jazz, and some folk music are commonly mixed this way.
It's gonna be okay, be okay, be okay.
Steely Dan is a good example of this style of mixing. Very few effects are used to create as clean and clear of a mix as possible. These types of mixes are normally done with very few or no effects at all. On the other hand, many styles of music are commonly mixed with a good amount of effects to create either a massive wall of sound type of mix or to create a spacious or spacey type of mix like Pink Floyd. It was Phil Spector who was known for first creating these types of mixes. For the longest time, everybody was addicted to clarity. Then Phil came along, started adding more and more instruments to the mix, and started using reverb to really fill out the space between the speakers. His mixes were dubbed the Wall of Sound. These days, we've taken this concept to the extreme. Just how many sounds can we fit in this space between the speakers? A lot of space rock, heavy metal, hard rock, alternative music, grunge, and even new age are commonly mixed with a lot of effects.
Now, if we use the analogy of a mix being like the thoughts in your brain, a clean, clear mix would be like this. Some people might think of this as a very orderly brain, like someone who has all their thoughts in place. Now, on the other hand, some of you might think of this as a boring brain, I'm sure you would prefer the exciting activity of a brain that looks like this. Neurons firing all over the place, large amounts of interactivity going on between the areas of the brain.
A full or sparse mix might be appropriate depending on the type of person, the nature of the song, and of course, the style of music.
Well, finally, we've now arrived at the last part of this section on effects.
There are a number of ways that you can create movement with effects. First, you can simply turn up or down the amount of the effects in the mix. But you can also change the type of effect or change the parameters within each effect. Needless to say, when you go changing the amount of effects or the type of effects in a song, this dynamic becomes the sole focus of attention for the moment. Some groups like Frank Zappa, Mr. Bungle, and even Pink Floyd have gone to the extreme of creating songs that are based around changing effects. Also, the capabilities of doing this are becoming much simpler now with MIDI control of effects. You can create subtler differences between sections of a song, but again, only if it's appropriate for the song and style of music, and if the people you're working with will let you. We have now covered all of the 4 tools that can be used to create dynamics in a mix. By using the tools together to create combinations of dynamics, we can create all the different styles of mixes in the world. Let's look at how they can work together to create really major dynamics. We can use all 4 tools to create an incredibly powerful dynamic. For example, say we're mixing a love song. We could set relative volumes even so that nothing jumps out and shocks us, so that the mood of the emotion is not disturbed, so that love can grow without distraction. We could set the EQ so that nothing is too irritating in the mid-ranges, so that everything is nice and bright, but not too bright, and so that there isn't too much bass to blow the mood. We could set the panning so that it's balanced like a love relationship should be. We could use very few effects such that the mix is clean and clear, like all our minds should be when in love. And we could refrain from creating any unnecessary movement with the faders, pan pops, EQ, or effects so as to not spoil the mood. Using all of these tools together, we can create one intensely beautiful dynamic, totally appropriate for the song. It's like being another musician in the band. It's like the equipment in the studio is your instrument. On the other hand, if we're mixing some rock and roll or even hip-hop, we might set volume relationships to be quite uneven, really soft sounds, and then it jumps out and grabs your attention, creating a very exciting dynamic. Fun, not boring at all. We could set EQ so that we get lots of highs and lots of lows. Boom! And we could EQ some sounds so they cut through and are edgy in the mid-range, making the whole mix jump out and grab your attention, forcing you to dance and forcing you to smile. We could set the panning to be unbalanced, creating tension and making the mix unusual. Let's have some fun. Rock and roll. We could add all kinds of different effects, making the mix interesting at every single moment. Let's not fool around. Let's change the world. Enough of the status quo. We could also have things zooming left and right with panning, volumes going up and down, EQ changing throughout the mix, and effects not only going up and down, but also the parameters of the effect changing constantly throughout the entire mix. When you pull them all together, we can create one hell of an exciting and exhilarating mix. These are 2 extreme types of mixes that we could create with all of the tools, all of the equipment in the studio. There are a million possibilities of dynamics between these two extremes, and all mixes in the world fall somewhere in between these two extremes. Now, one of the most powerful dynamics that a recording engineer can create is to first create a context. That is, create a mix where all of the tools are working together to create a cohesive style of mix. Then, without warning, completely change all of the parameters of the mix with all four of the tools to create a completely different style of mix. Yes did it with Owner of a Lonely Heart. They took a screaming electric guitar sound, and in a single moment it breaks down into a 50s style recording of a drum set with dull EQ and mics 20 feet away. Then, all of a sudden, it's back to a screaming guitar synthesizer type sound that is extremely edgy. The sudden change in mixed parameters was quite effective. Sting also did it with the song Englishman in New York. The song goes from a jazzy groove with a jazz-style mix, very few effects, very clean sounding, to all of a sudden a huge drum sound with tons of reverb. Then all of a sudden we're back to the simple, clear jazz mix. Awesome, exhilarating, and quite interesting. Of course, you can only create such dramatic mix dynamics if it's appropriate for the song. In fact, I'm always on the lookout for bands that have written songs where such cool dynamics are appropriate. This was obviously one of Frank Zappa's favorite techniques. Mr. Bungle has taken the concept to the extreme. Every 30 seconds, the song in the mix changes completely. To do this can be shocking. It can even blow people's minds. It shows people that their reality is just an illusion, that it could all change at any moment. But best of all, it shows perspective. It shows people that they need not stay stuck in their current reality. They only need to put a different mix on the situation. All of the mixes in the world are created with just these four tools: volume, EQ, panning, and effects. Every mix for every style of music in the world is made up with these four tools and the wide range of dynamics that they can create. The art of mixing is the way the dynamics we create with the equipment in the studio interface with the dynamics apparent in music and songs. Now that we have covered all of the dynamics that you can create with the equipment, we can now begin to explore all of the different relationships between mixing dynamics and the dynamics that people perceive in music. However, we'll let you begin this lifelong exploration on your own.
The last video in the series used the visual framework explained in the earlier videos to show and explain all the different types of mixes that a recording engineer can create. Particularly, it shows the traditions that have developed over the years for mixing different styles of music. In this last video, we have covered and you have learned about the wide range of emotional dynamics that are found in music: emotions, structures, physical reactions, visual imagery, and spiritual aspects. We then covered the dynamics that can be created with each of the 4 tools based on individual settings, patterns of settings, and movement. We showed how different individual volumes create dynamics. We introduced you to the 6 levels of volume and then covered how each instrument sound is placed at different volumes for different styles of music and songs. We showed the dynamics that can be created through different volume patterns such as uneven volumes versus even volumes. And we showed the dynamics created by moving volume faders in a mix. We then went through different EQ dynamics created by EQing individual sounds. We then covered the more intense dynamic created by the overall EQ, or EQ patterns. We then discussed the intense dynamic of changing EQ during a mix. Next, we looked at the different traditions in panning different styles of music and the traditions for panning particular instrument sounds. We then covered the dynamics created by overall panning patterns, such as symmetrical mixes and asymmetrical mixes. We advanced to the dynamic created by moving pan pots during the mix and showed different types of panning movement. We then checked out the dynamics created with individual effects such as fattening, flanging, and reverb. We looked at the dynamics you can design through various patterns of effects, that is, full wall of sound mixes versus clean and clear sparse mixes. We then went through the dynamics of changing effects in a mix. We showed various ways that effects are changed during a mix. We then explained how you can create different styles of mixes using the 4 tools, such as what might be appropriate for a love song, or for a really cool, chaotic mix. Using the 4 tools, we showed the wide range of mixes an engineer can create. We then pointed out and showed the most intense dynamic of all, to completely change the style of mix in a single moment. Finally, we set you off on the journey of learning how to create all these dynamics with the equipment to best fit the dynamics in music and songs. This is the true art of mixing.